posters I had seen on the wall at McGill described it as a study tour. We would visit the Canadian battlefields and memorials in France, Belgium, and Holland, and learn about the role of the Canadians in the liberation of Europe. But it was only once I was there, in Europe, that I realized that the tour was more like a pilgrimage. Here was the medieval landscape of cathedrals and towns, a clear route to be followed, and a group of strangers set out with a purpose in mind. We were Chaucer's sundry folk indeed.
We began our pilgrimage at Beaumont-Hamel, a Canadian National Heritage Park in the heart of the Somme Valley, which commemorates the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. Early the next morning, I walked to the cathedral. The stained glass windows were ablaze with light. I lit a candle, for 5 francs, and said a prayer for those unknown soldiers I had met yesterday at Beaumont-Hamel. On our way to Vimy, we talked about the meaning of the First World War, for both those who had joined up in 1939 and for our generation. We would learn about the men and women who volunteered to liberate Europe, but we had to make up our own minds about what it all meant to our generation. Our next stop was Dieppe. One of our goals is to visit all the Canadian war cemeteries. But none of us was prepared for Dieppe. My first emotion was nervousness. I was struck by how quiet it was. There was only birdsong and the wind shivering in the trees. The families had selected the words carefully for each grave marker. My ability to keep back tears was undone by the words, "Perhaps one day we will understand." All these years later, do we yet understand what happened that terrible day at Dieppe? Will we ever understand it? Then some familiar words leapt out at me. He was a very parfait, gentle knight. Chaucer. 500-year-old words to speak for a young soul, now 50 years dead. There were almost no words between us in the ride over to Blue Beach at Puy, where the Royal Regiment of Canada had landed. We all stared in amazement at this beach. How could anyone have survived? How had Colonel Cato and his men made it up that cliff face? Some of the boys tried to find out, and found the climb itself was a challenge without anyone firing at them. The next morning, we met at the memorial to the Fusiliers Mont Royal in the center of the main beach. Terry Kopp began a day-long discussion of the background and purposes of the raid with a question, and Patrice Collin, a student who had studied Dieppe for the tour, got us started.
Okay, but you instruct me. I'm a company commander. I'm going to come on the assault. What am I supposed to do? What's it about?
Take your objective.
What's my objective?
Secure the, well, it was secure the town to a certain extent, go further, then set up a perimeter, especially the tanks where you can defend that further pullback. But it was really to take, to a certain extent, either part of the town or the town itself.
Front of the bunker facing the sea, you can see how thick it is. And unless you go on a
After visiting Green Beach at Pourville, we set off for Caen and the Abbey d'Ardennes, where we were to spend the next week. The 13th century abbey has been renovated as a residence and conference center, but for us Canadians, this will always be the place where the 19 Canadian prisoners of war were murdered by the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division. One reason we are here is to participate in an annual act of remembrance in the garden where the murders took place.
27. Charles Doucette, 31. Reginald Keeping, 21 years old. Hugh Allen MacDonald, 24. Joseph Francis McIntyre, 28. Hollis Leslie McKeel, 33. George Richard McNaughton, 20. George Edward Miller, 19. Thomas Edward Mont, 23. Raymond Moore, 27. And James Alvin Moss, 22. Les Fusiliers de Sherbrooke. James Elgin Bolt, 24 ans. George Vincent Gill, 23 ans. Thomas Halliburton Henry, 22 ans. Roger Lockhead, 25 ans. Harold George Phillip, 32 ans. And Thomas Alfred Lee Windsor, 29 ans. From the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, George Gerald Pollard, 19, and Fred Williams, 22.
Today we explored the Canadian beaches codenamed Juno. Our first stop was Mike Red Beach, where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed. Their war diary for June 6 noted, the bombardment having failed to kill a single German or silence one weapon, those companies had to storm their positions cold, and did so without hesitation. Standing beside one of the huge concrete bunkers, we could only marvel at the courage of those men. We then drove to Bernières-sur-Mer, where the Queen's Own Rifles landed, and tried to imagine the race across the beach to take out the pillboxes called resistance nests. At Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, the 50mm gun, which was part of the defenses, is still intact. The seawall and town look just as they did in 1944. The North Shores and Fort Garry Horse landed here, followed by the Royal Marine Commandos. Taking all the information I had learned over the past few days and trying to picture the scene that day was amazing. I can't get over how important it is to actually see the place that you've been studying. Our visit to the Canadian cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer was scheduled for the next morning. I really was fine at first, but as we spread out across the cemetery, clutching our cameras and our flags, row after row, name after name, my tears would not stop. I turned my head to look out at the golden fields beside us and let them trickle down my face. Terry wants us to understand the complexity of the situation the soldiers faced, and today we participated in a historical tactical exercise without troops, or TOOT. We were split into two groups, one with Lieutenant Colonel Dave Patterson as advisor, and the other with our Foundation's Vice President, Lieutenant General Charles Belzile. We had to prepare a plan from maps and air photos, and then do a detailed reconnaissance of the ground. General Belzile, who was with our group, was really helpful. Our task was to study the situation confronting the Regina Rifles on D+1 as they advanced to Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse. Back at the Abbaye, we presented our solution and listened as the other syndicate talked about defending Puteaux-en-Bessin. The Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation was started by veterans who were afraid that the memory of Canada's part in the war was being forgotten. Their first project was to create a memorial garden on the grounds of the new Camp Museum, the Mémorial. Students from Carleton University in Ottawa and L'Université de Montréal designed the garden. The reflecting pool is surrounded by sand to symbolize the D-Day beaches. A low wall is inscribed with the names of all the towns in Normandy liberated by the Canadians. Across the valley, a winding path representing the long uphill struggle leads to a platform and a large inscription. La libération vient par la mer. Liberation comes from the sea. Glass panels list all the names of the units that fought here to liberate France.
Était libéré du joug nazi par les armées canadiennes et britanniques, et en particulier ceux qui sont morts.
Our days were full of activity. On June 5th, we went to the Le Mesnil crossroads and the monument to the heroic 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, and then onto Pegasus Bridge. we attended the local D-Day ceremonies at Saint-Aubin and Bernières, where our friends Walter and George from the Queen's Own Rifles played the last post. General Belzile left today, but Dennis and Sheila Whitaker have joined us. Brigadier Whitaker won 2 DSOs at Dieppe and in the Rhineland. What an extraordinary man! The Whitakers are writing their 4th book, a tribute to the veterans of Normandy. We began our study of Verrières Ridge at the village captured by General Whitaker's regiment, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. He had been wounded a few days before the battle, and this was his first visit to Verrières. From the top of Point 67, we had an incredible view of the battlefield, and we could only imagine the dilemma facing the Canadians. I was reminded of the words from the official history and my role as a pilgrim. C.P. Stacy wrote, 3 miles or so south of Caen, the present-day tourist, driving down the arrow straight road that leads to Falaise, sees immediately to his right a rounded hill crowned by farm buildings. If the traveller be Canadian, he would do well to stay at the wheels at this point and cast his mind back to the events of 1944, for this apparently insignificant eminence is Verrières Ridge. Well may the wheat and sugar beet grow lush upon its gentle slopes, for in that now half-forgotten summer, the best blood of Canada was freely poured out upon them. The Canadian Military Cemetery at Saint-Saulve contains the graves of 2,872 of our soldiers. We listened politely to the mayor of Saint-Saulve, but we really wanted to be alone. I overheard Brigadier Whitaker say quietly that 5 or 6 of his good friends were buried there. At the Polish cemetery, Terry told the story of the Polish Armored Division escaping to France, then Britain, in 1940. They fought as part of 1st Canadian Army while their own country and its capital, Warsaw, was being destroyed. Kelly Deschênes led the discussion of Operation Totalize. Having students prepare talks is such a great idea. Kelly described the fate of the British Columbia and Algonquin regiments at Point 145 and told us about the heroic nighttime advance of the Argylls.
They were in file, single file, and they took the position, and then they had to.
We then had a picnic lunch in Rouvres, where the Canadians crossed the liaison in Operation Tractable. This was one of the best discussions of the tour. Brigadier Whitaker reminded us that battle exhaustion can vary greatly from group to group. The qualities of the officers and NCOs can make a big difference. In fact, lying on the grass on that incredible, beautiful day, with the wind blowing through the trees, I couldn't help thinking, what a wonderful way this is to learn. On a hill outside Trun, we could see the Dives Valley laid out below us. The struggle to close the Falaise Gap looks much more difficult on the ground than on a map. Moving through the succession of sharp, tiny valleys, I understood how the Germans could escape, particularly at night. When we entered Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive and saw a memorial to Major David Curry, who won the Victoria Cross there, I could only then really appreciate what he and his men had accomplished. William the Conqueror's castle in Falaise brought me back to medieval times and reminded me of Chaucer's Pilgrims. And now we too were on the road again. First to Rouen, and then to the Channel ports, and then to Bruges. The gun batteries at Cap Grinet still have Nazi soldiers' wall art and graffiti from 1944. In the dark, that was very eerie. Bruges was amazing. The Germans agreed to evacuate the city, and the Canadians waited until they left. The medieval buildings are one of Europe's greatest treasures. We set out first for the Canadian Military Cemetery, one day after visiting the one at Calais. We needed to do this, but that didn't make it any easier. Walking down a row of markers, the words chosen by each family have such an emotional impact. Some are like a personal note from the living to the dead. I didn't know what to expect as we drove to the Canada Museum. The museum was created by Gilbert Van Landshut as a tribute to the Canadians who had liberated Western Belgium. His father, an active member of the resistance, had been saved from arrest by the Gestapo because of the timely arrival of our troops.
Germans here and the Nazis. She made here a big airport. 1,000 people had here hunger, there was no war.
After the museum, we walked the banks of the Leopold Canal, climbing on top of a pillbox bunker to discuss 3rd Division's part in the struggle to open the Scheldt estuary. The British, with help from the Belgian resistance, had seized the port of Antwerp, but the Germans occupied both sides of the river, Walcheren Island and the Breskens Pocket. 3rd Division, which had been fighting continuously ever since D-Day, used 7th Brigade to attack across this canal, attracting enemy reserves, while 9th Brigade used amphibious vehicles called buffaloes to stage a surprise landing. We did not neglect 2nd Division's battles at Wonstrecht and the Walcheren Causeway. Despite the rain, we had a close look at Wonstrecht. Brigadier Whittaker was no longer with our group, but he had commanded the Rileys when they captured the village, and we really wanted to see the ground. Nijmegen was our last stop. After breakfast, we set off to the Grosbeek Cemetery. Patrice made a special trip to Holten, where his uncle was buried, but for the rest of us, Grosbeek and the battlefields of the Rhineland were the last stop on our pilgrimage. It had rained the night before and was still drizzling. The maple trees hung low over the graves. Walking along, one marker took me by surprise. It read, Ton front est saint, de fleurons glorieux. Ta valeur protégera nos foyers et nos droits. It was time to say goodbye. I guess I had started to think that the trip would never end, that the little buses would drive into the sunset, with Terry's hand forever pointing to something outside the window. Never again would I share in this incredible experience with these wonderful people. I just didn't want it to end. Our farewell dinner was on a boat anchored in the river, close to the Nijmegen Bridge that Alec Colville sketched and painted in 1945. Jeff reminded us that Nijmegen was a point of departure for Canadian troops after victory in 1945. While sad, the food was marvelous and spirits soared.
And I hope thus that holds true.
In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of all that had happened in these 3 short weeks. I remembered a bright silver memorial near the Grosbeek Cemetery, which marks the start line of the last great battle Canadians fought in World War II. Inscribed in Dutch and in English are the words, "Pilgrim, strive with whatever it takes to realize your ideals."